There is an extraordinarily strange psychological state that you have almost certainly experienced at least once in your life, yet you likely didn't know what to call it. It's that haunting moment when you wake up on a Monday morning in a city that never stops moving, a city like New York. You lie there in the dim, dusty light of your Brooklyn apartment, staring at a long list of tasks sitting abandoned on your desk, and you feel an invisible weight pressing down on your chest, as if the very air in the room has turned into cold, heavy stone. It isn't physical pain in the way we usually define it. It is something far more sinister, far more paralyzing. It is a total, crushing paralysis of the will. You know, with absolute intellectual clarity that you need to get up. So you are acutely aware of the consequences of your procrastination. You can see the deadlines piling up like treacherous snowdrifts outside your door. You can feel the inevitable disappointment of your boss, the silent judgment of your peers, and the suffocating anxiety of bills that simply won't pay themselves. Your mind is screaming at your limbs to move, but instead of taking action, you remain motionless on your familiar sweat-stained bed. You spend 3 hours scrolling through your phone in a mindless gray trance, letting a gnawing sense of guilt eat away at your mind like termites silently hollowing out a rotted support beam in a house that's about to collapse. When you fall into this state, the world outside, and even the cruel, relentless voice inside your own head, immediately slaps a label on you. They call it laziness. They call you undisciplined, weak-willed, a failure of a human being. The motivational videos on your feed scream at you to just get up and stop making excuses. You listen to them. You try to force yourself. You grit your teeth until your jaw aches and you strain every mental muscle you have. And yet you only end up feeling more disappointed, hating yourself more because your body simply refuses to respond. It is as if the connection between your brain and your muscles has been severed by an invisible hand. But what if the very thing you're fighting isn't a lack of character, but a desperate act of biological sabotage? From the perspective of neuroscience, what is happening in your head at that moment has absolutely nothing to do with laziness. In reality, your brain has triggered an emergency shutdown mechanism. It isn't being lazy, it is pulling the plug on the entire system to save your life from a total neurochemical meltdown. The difference between being lazy and having a temporarily broken nervous system, otherwise known as burnout, is a razor-thin line. But understanding that line is the single most important factor for your mental health, your career, and your future. To understand exactly what is happening inside your tangled web of nerves right now, we need to look at a man named Mark. Mark is 28 years old, a typical, hard-working office professional living in the relentless grind of New York City. He is currently standing at the red line of neurological exhaustion, but he mistakenly believes he is just becoming useless. Let us perform a deep tissue psychological autopsy on Mark's mind, because within his struggle lies the secret code that your brain uses to decide when you finally had enough. Look at Mark on a Tuesday afternoon in his Manhattan office. Around him, the office is a frantic hive of activity. Colleagues are debating fiercely in glass-walled conference rooms. The printer is whirring like a jet engine, and the rhythmic drumbeat of mouse clicks fills the air. Mark is sitting at his desk, typing, occasionally nodding to his manager. To any outsider, he looks like a productive member of society. But if you were to look deep into his eyes, you would see a hollowness that is chilling. Mark feels like a ghost haunted by his own life. He feels as if he is floating 10 feet above the conference table, coldly observing his own body perform repetitive robotic movements. He hears the sounds of the office, but they have no meaning to him. They are just white noise. This is the first definitive sign of burnout, depersonalization. This isn't a lack of interest. It is the brain's ultimate high-level defense mechanism. Imagine your brain as a massive, nuclear-powered ship, and the prefrontal cortex, the sophisticated area right behind your forehead, is the rational captain at the helm. This captain is responsible for your logic, your focus, and your social engagement. When the ship enters a storm of stress, skyrocketing NYC rent, toxic politics, 80-hour work weeks that lasts for too many months, the captain realizes that if he continues to let the crew feel the full, agonizing force of every violent wave, the entire electrical system of the ship will be permanently damaged. But how does the captain choose between keeping the ship moving and letting the engine explode? The brain makes a brutal binary choice. It cuts the connection between the bridge and the rest of the ship. It creates a thick, emotional wall of fog so that you don't have to feel the pain, the fatigue, or the crushing pressure anymore. Mark is in autopilot mode. If you feel like you are no longer yourself, if your own life feels foreign, soulless, and distant, do not blame yourself for being cold or unfeeling. This is simply your brain's desperate attempt to protect your soul from being burned to a crisp. The captain hasn't abandoned you. He's just locked the doors to the bridge to keep the fire from spreading to the core. This leads us to the second and perhaps most diagnostic difference between laziness and burnout: the weight of your own history. If laziness is a constant state of being, besides, why does it only feel like a prison once you've already achieved everything you thought you wanted? Laziness is what we call a character trait. It is like a slow, lazy river that flows at the same sluggish pace year after year. A truly lazy person generally feels quite comfortable doing nothing. They don't suffer from midnight terrors of guilt. They don't stay up at night crying about their lack of productivity. They simply accept their ease as a fundamental part of who they are. But Mark is fundamentally different. 2 years ago, Mark was the golden boy of the office. He was the one who came up with the boldest ideas, the one who was the last to leave the building at night with a burning passion. Mark loved the feeling of success. He thrived on the electric pace of New York. So what caused a burning star to turn into a dying ember? In the complex language of neuroscience, Mark has spent his dopamine baseline. Dopamine isn't just a feel-good chemical, it is the fundamental level of motivation in the brain. It is the fuel that makes you want to reach for things. When you force your body to work past its biological limits for long periods, the pleasure receptors in your brain literally shut down. They perform a process called receptor downregulation to prevent the system from burning out due to overstimulation. It is exactly like a power generator that is run completely out of fuel but is still being forced to light up an entire city. What is the inevitable result? The generator stops. It seizes up. Not because it's lazy, but because it has absolutely nothing left to give. If you were once an ambitious person but now find yourself feeling like a hollow shell, understand this. You haven't lost your identity. You are simply a marathon runner who has run too far without a single drop of water, and your body has finally demanded a mandatory stop. But what happens when even the things that used to give you water now taste like ash? This paralysis doesn't just stop at work. It begins to leak into the smallest corners of your soul, revealing the third sign, anhedonia. Mark used to have a burning passion for modifying old cars and playing his vintage Fender guitar. These were his oases, the places he went to recover after a stressful week. But lately, every time Mark looks at that guitar hanging on his wall, he doesn't feel joy. He feels a burden. The simple act of picking up the guitar has suddenly become mentally exhausting. Shacks as if he were solving a multivariable calculus problem while sleep-deprived. The very thing that used to save him now feels like just another item on a to-do list that he cannot finish. This is the loss of the ability to feel pleasure. A lazy person still enjoys fun. A lazy person will happily skip work to play video games for 12 hours because it feels good. But for someone suffering from burnout like Mark, even fun is tiring. Why does the brain do this? Because every activity requires neurological energy. When you're in a state of energy bankruptcy, your brain implements an extreme policy of austerity. It cuts the entire budget for luxuries like joy and passion to divert every remaining spark of energy to maintaining basic survival functions. Your brain is essentially under metabolic austerity. Every thought and movement requires adenosine triphosphate, ATP, the cellular currency of energy. In burnout, your mitochondria are struggling. You haven't stopped loving your hobbies. Mark hasn't become a boring person. It is just that his brain is in maximum power-saving mode, and in that mode, the vibrant colors of life are forced to turn into shades of gray to save the battery. But if the brain is trying to save energy, why does it suddenly have enough power to fuel a sudden, explosive rage? This brings us to the fourth sign, the one that causes the most social damage, the fragile fuse. Mark was always the gentle guy, but lately he has become more explosive than he ever thought possible. A simple Slack notification from his boss at 6 p.m. makes his blood boil. A kind question from his mother feels like a personal insult. Even the tiny sound of a spoon dropping on the floor can make Mark want to scream. Why do we become so irritable when we are exhausted? This is the amygdala hijack. Your amygdala is the panic guard of the brain. Its only job is to scream danger when it perceives a threat. In a healthy person, the prefrontal cortex keeps this guard in check, using logic to calm the situation. But in a burnt-out person, that control center is paralyzed by fatigue. The panic guard takes full control of the ship. Because there is no energy left to analyze whether a problem is small or large, Mark's brain perceives every stimulus as a direct, violent attack on his survival. You aren't mean, and Mark isn't disrespectful. You are simply a soldier who has been in the trenches for too long without relief. You are severely wounded, and when an unhealed wound is touched, even by a feather, the only natural reflex is to roar in self-defense. This is the cry of a nervous system that can't take one more ounce of pressure. Yet the most disturbing part isn't the rage you show the world. It's the quiet decay you hide within your own four walls. The fifth sign is the one that Mark hides from everyone: the total collapse of self-care. If you were to walk into Mark's apartment right now, you would see a mountain of dirty dishes in the sink. Clothes are strewn across the floor. The trash hasn't been taken out in a week, and Mark himself hasn't showered in 3 days. People looking from the outside would immediately judge him as lazy, but as a neuroscientist, I see something else entirely. Biological triage. In an emergency room, doctors don't bandage a broken finger if the patient next to them is bleeding from the chest. Your brain is doing the same thing. When you only have 1% battery left, the brain cuts all power to the passenger cabin, things like hygiene or housework, to divert energy to the engine room, keeping the heart beating and the lungs breathing. This is a state known as sickness behavior, often triggered by the vagus nerve. For Mark, picking up a sponge feels as heavy as a 500-pound deadlift. This isn't a lack of hygiene, it is a strategic withdrawal of energy. His brain has decided that looking professional is not required for survival. But what if I told you that while your brain is trying to save your body, it is actually physically shrinking your mind? The final sign is the slow erosion of your cognitive ability, often felt as brain fog. Mark is starting to forget basic things. He loses his keys twice a day. He's missing appointments. His mind feels like it's filled with thick gray cotton. This is the result of chronic cortisol exposure. Cortisol is useful for short bursts of energy, but when it's pumped into your system for months, it becomes a neurotoxin. It actually causes the hippocampus, the part of the brain responsible for memory, to physically shrink. This isn't a bad mood. It is a physical brain injury. Mark hasn't lost his edge because he's lazy. He has damage from being too strong for too long. Burnout is the biological tax we pay for ignoring our limits. You cannot motivate your way out of a damaged hippocampus any more than you can hustle your way out of a broken leg. You are a biological organism that has gone into hibernation to survive a harsh internal winter. The question is, how do you wake up from a winter that feels like it's never going to end? So, how do we flip the circuit breaker back on? How do we save Mark? And how do we save you? If you treat burnout like laziness, you will only make it worse. If you tell a burnt-out person to work harder, you are essentially whipping a horse that has collapsed from exhaustion. It won't make the horse run. It will only kill the horse faster. The first, most difficult step to recovery isn't action. It is the absolute pardon. You must stop calling yourself lazy. When you insult yourself, your brain releases even more cortisol. You're trying to put out a fire by pouring gasoline on it. Mark's journey back didn't start with a new to-do list. It started when he allowed himself to not exist for a while. In neuroscience, we call this the path to neuroplasticity. Your brain is not a fixed machine. It is a living forest. It can heal, but only when it is in an anabolic or building state, not a catabolic or breaking down state. To start this process, Mark had to distinguish between fake rest and passive rest. Mark used to lie in bed and scroll through social media for hours, thinking he was resting. But that is fake rest. His visual cortex and dopamine receptors were being bombarded with information and social comparison. To reboot the system, you must practice passive rest. This means minimizing cognitive bandwidth. It means staring at the clouds. It means a walk in a park without a podcast. It means lying in total silence, processing nothing. In these moments of boredom, the default mode network, DMN, in your brain can finally begin its work of defragmentation, cleaning out neural waste and repairing damaged cells. You cannot heal an overloaded brain by stuffing more entertainment into it. But once you've cleared the waste, how do you ensure the fire doesn't just start all over again? The answer lies in an identity shift. Mark's story isn't a story of failure. Burnout is not a punishment for the weak. It is the biological tax you pay for being too strong, for carrying too much, and for striving too hard for too long, without building a charging station for yourself. Your exhaustion today is the physical evidence of how much you have given to a world that never stops taking. So, the next time you wake up and your body feels like lead, please, do not call yourself lazy. Listen to the scream of your nervous system. Turn off your phone and close your eyes. And give yourself the one thing you've been denying yourself for years, the permission to simply exist. Your brain isn't broken permanently. It's just waiting for you to prove that it's finally safe to come back online. If this journey through Mark's mind helped lift that weight of guilt off your shoulders, understand that you are not alone in the dark. We are all just biological machines trying to find our way back to the light. Don't let anyone call your exhausted strength laziness. Protect your brain, because it is the only home you truly have. Now, for the sake of your soul, allow yourself to rest for a while. The world will still be there when you return, but you might finally be ready to face it as yourself again.